Hello, my dear ones. Come sit with me, take off your shoes. Let the day's weight slip from your shoulders. I know you've been busy, running, worrying, working hard. And now it's time to breathe. Just breathe. The world can wait for a little. While, here with me, the air feels softer, the corners of the room gentle and warm. Maybe you'll hear the quiet hum of the evening, a distant bird, the whisper of leaves. It's all for you. Let your hands rest. Let your eyes grow soft. Imagine a cup of something warm in front of you, the steam curling lazily. Maybe a little blanket brushing your knees. We'll take this time together, away from deadlines and noise, away from the hurried steps outside. Just for a few moments, your heart can relax, your thoughts can wander safely, and every worry that clings can drift away with a gentle sigh. I'll tell you stories, soft and vivid, to make your mind wander, to let your imagination stretch its wings. And while you listen, let yourself smile quietly. Feel cozy, feel held. Let this be the pause you've been needing, the little corner of peace in your day. Welcome, my dear, welcome home. Sundarpur woke before the sun that morning, not because roosters crowed louder than usual, but because the heat had already begun to stir the earth. The air felt thick as warm milk, leaves rustled, though there was no breeze, and somewhere a wooden cart creaked as if the village itself was stretching after uneasy sleep. The river whispered softly. Children laughed in half-dreams, and under all that sweetness, something unseen seemed to be holding its breath. By the time the sun climbed higher, farmers were already bent over their fields, wiping sweat from their brows with worn sleeves, their footsteps pressing into dry soil that cracked like old pottery. Oxen snorted impatiently, and sickles flashed dull silver under the light. Conversations floated across the fields in low murmurs, about harvests, about prices, about who owed whom. And though voices sounded ordinary, there was a tightness to them, as if words were chosen carefully, like stepping over stones in shallow water near the river. Children splashed and shrieked with laughter, chasing dragonflies and daring each other to jump from smooth rocks. Mira watched them from the shade of a banyan tree, holding her cotton dupatta close to her neck. She smiled, yet her eyes lingered on the forest line beyond the fields. Darker than usual, quiet in a way she could not explain. She told herself it was only the heat making her uneasy. Still, she reminded the children to stay close, her voice gentle but firm, as if she too sensed that the day needed careful handling. Gossip moved faster than the river that day, slipping from courtyard to courtyard. From well to tea stall, women spoke while drawing water, lowering their voices whenever certain names were mentioned. Men paused longer than needed over cups of tea, eyes darting sideways. Old arguments rose again like dust shaken from rugs. Land disputes, unpaid loans, hurtful words spoken years ago and never forgiven. No one argued openly, but silence itself felt crowded, heavy with things unsaid. Old Rahim sat outside his house, his walking stick resting across his knees, watching it all with eyes that had seen many summers. He hummed an old tune, the kind that mothers used to quiet crying babies. Yet his fingers tightened around the stick whenever he glanced toward the forest. A boy asked him why the birds were flying so low. Rahim smiled and said, "Birds feel the weather before people do," then fell quiet, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. At the edge of the village, Aref returned from his morning run, dust clinging to his ankles, his breath steady and strong. He laughed with a group of boys, asking about his firefighter training, telling them stories that made their eyes shine. Yet even as he spoke, he noticed how dry the grass felt under his fingers, how easily it snapped. He brushed the thought away. Danger always seemed far away until it arrived, and Sundarpur had always been safe, had it not. As evening crept closer, shadows stretched lazily across courtyards. The smell of cooking filled the air, lentils simmering, bread puffing on open flames. Mothers called their children home. Lamps were cleaned and set out for nightfall, and the forest stood silent beyond. The fields dark and watchful, as if keeping a secret. The village settled into its familiar rhythm, unaware that the warmth of the day would soon turn into something far less gentle, something already stirring quietly just beyond sight. The first sound was not fire, it was a dry whisper, leaves rubbing against each other deep in the forest, followed by a sudden flicker of light that danced and jumped like a naughty child. A lantern swung too close to brittle branches, and before anyone could scold the moment, a spark leaped free, eager and hungry, vanishing into the undergrowth as if it had found a long-awaited home. At first, the forest only sighed. A thin curl of smoke rose lazily between the trees, pale and almost shy. Birds startled and flapped upward, their wings beating fast. The man holding the lantern laughed nervously, stamping his foot and thinking the earth would listen. But the ground was dry and tired. It did not obey. Instead, the spark crept quietly, feeding on leaves that crumbled at its touch. Far across the fields, Mira paused mid-step while carrying a bundle of school books. She squinted toward the horizon, where the sky seemed to smudge itself with gray. She told herself it was dust, the kind that rose when cattle moved together. Still, her chest tightened. The air smelled different, sharper, like burnt grass after a careless match. She whispered a short prayer without knowing why, then hurried the children inside, closing the wooden doors a little more firmly than usual. Soon, someone shouted near the well, fingers pointed, voices overlapped. Smoke was no longer shy now. It climbed boldly upward, spreading wide like a dark scarf across the sky. Panic stirred unevenly. Some women clutched their chests, others laughed it off, saying the forest always burned a little in summer. Men argued whether it was worth bothering the whole village over. After all, the trees were far, were they not? Arif heard the noise while repairing a broken fence. He straightened at once, eyes sharp, training tugging at his instincts. He ran to higher ground, shielding his eyes with his hand. The sight made his stomach drop. Smoke, thick and steady, meant only one thing: fire that had found confidence. He called out orders before anyone asked him to, his voice calm but firm. Fetch water. Move cattle away from the forest edge. Keep children close. Yet not everyone listened. Old habits are stubborn things. One man scoffed, saying fires had come before and gone on their own. Another complained about wasting daylight. Arif clenched his jaw, but kept moving. Fear could wait. Action could not. He felt the dryness in the wind, how it brushed his skin like hot breath, how even his own sweat seemed ready to burn. Old Rahim stood apart from the crowd, leaning heavily on his stick, his eyes never leaving the smoke. Memories stirred in him like embers. He had seen this once before, long ago, when another secret had been buried beneath ashes. A child tugged at his sleeve, asking if the fire would reach the village. Rahim rested his hand on the small head and said softly, "Fire listens to the wind, and today the wind is restless." As bells rang to call people together, the village filled with hurried footsteps. The smell of smoke grew stronger, catching in throats, stinging eyes. Mira gathered her students close, her hands trembling slightly as she counted them again and again. She thought of books, of stories, of how knowledge felt so fragile now. Like paper held too near a flame, she swallowed her fear and smiled for the children. Because courage often begins with pretending. By late afternoon, the sky had dimmed unnaturally, shadows blurred, and the sun looked tired behind the smoke. Sundarpur buzzed with nervous energy, half belief, half denial. Buckets were filled, arguments rose and fell, and somewhere deep in the forest, the fire stretched itself wider, crackling softly like a creature waking from sleep, waiting patiently, as if knowing the village would soon have no choice but to notice it fully. The fire announced itself with a roar like dry cloth tearing apart. Flames leaped suddenly from the forest edge, as if the trees themselves had flung them forward. Sparks flew high and scattered wildly, landing wherever the wind carried them, and the air shuddered with heat so sharp it made eyes water and hearts race. In that moment, Sundarpur understood that this was no distant trouble anymore. It had crossed the line into their lives. Shouts rose all at once. Mothers screamed names. Fathers grabbed whatever they could carry. Goats broke free from their ropes and bolted blindly. Cows lowed in terror, their hooves kicking dust into the air. Children cried as smoke wrapped around the lanes, turning familiar paths into something strange and frightening. Pots were left boiling, doors stood open, and prayers spilled from lips without order. Arif ran through the chaos, with his sleeves rolled up and his voice steady like a drumbeat, forming a line from the well to the fields, handing out buckets with quick instructions. Pass and return, no stopping, no shouting, just move. Some villagers hesitated, some fumbled, but his calm carried weight. Fear softened when someone knew what to do, and slowly a rhythm formed. Water sloshing, feet pounding, breath sinking with effort. Still, the fire did not slow. It crept closer with cruel patience. Flames licking fences, devouring dry grass in hungry gulps. The heat pressed against faces like an unseen wall. Arif felt doubt flicker inside him for the first time. This was bigger than training drills, bigger than stories. Yet he pushed the thought away. Villages survived not by certainty, but by stubborn hope. At the school, Mira unlocked the door with shaking hands. Smoke had already seeped inside, curling around desks like curious fingers. She wrapped her dupatta over her mouth and rushed to the shelves. Lifting books into her arms, each one felt heavier than it should have, holding years of lessons, dreams, and borrowed wisdom. A child appeared at the door, calling her name. She smiled through tears and said, "Just a little more, Beta. Knowledge must be carried too." As she stepped back outside, ash drifted down like dark snow, stinging her skin. The sky glowed a dull orange, and the sound of fire crackling mixed with cries and commands. Mira felt a deep ache in her chest. Fear not for herself, but for the village children who trusted adults to keep the world safe. She whispered reassurances to herself as much as to them. reminding her heart that courage could be quiet. Old Rahim moved slowly among the people, guiding without raising his voice, telling some to wet the roofs, others to clear paths. His eyes, sharp despite the smoke, memories pressed against him like ghosts. He muttered to the fire under his breath, as if it were an old enemy he recognized. When a young man panicked and froze, Rahim placed a firm hand on his shoulder and said, "Fear listens to fire, but fire fears unity." The bucket line strained arms, burned, water spilled more than it landed, and yet the fire kept advancing. Villagers began to realize this was no ordinary summer blaze, no simple fight of water against flame. It had teeth and hunger. It knew the wind well. Silence fell briefly. As understanding spread, this would take more than habit and hope. It would demand sacrifice. As night edged closer, the flames painted the village in restless light. Shadows danced wildly across walls. Smoke wrapped the moon in a hazy veil, and somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, Sundarpur stood facing the fire together, unaware that deeper truths would soon rise from the ashes, just as the flames themselves continued to climb. Hungry and unafraid, the fire did not just burn wood that night. It brushed against voices, loosened tongues, and shook loose things that had been buried for years. As flames hissed and leaped nearby, arguments rose suddenly from the crowd like sparks, sharp and bright. Words once swallowed, now spilling freely, carried by heat and fear alike. Near the fields, two farming families who had avoided each other. 4 seasons finally collided. One accused the other of blocking water paths long ago, of stealing fertile land inch by inch. Their voices cracked as loudly as burning branches. Hands pointed. Old bitterness spilled out without care for timing. Others tried to pull them apart, shouting that fire did not choose sides. But anger rarely listens when it feels justified. Arif stepped between them, sweat streaking his face, his voice firmer now, telling them this was not the time, that fields could be argued over later if there was still a village left to stand on them. One man scoffed bitterly, saying some people always cared more for unity when it suited them. The words stung deeper than flames, and Arif felt frustration not inside him. Yet he forced himself to breathe. Leadership often meant swallowing pride. Behind a half-collapsed shed, Mira stumbled upon a sight she never expected. 2 young villagers stood close, hands clasped tightly, eyes wide with fear, not of fire, but of being seen. Their love had been whispered about, but never confirmed. Now smoke had stripped away caution. Mira met their gaze and saw only desperation and devotion. She said nothing, only nodded softly and ushered them toward safety. Secrets sometimes needed protection too. As the night thickened, Rahim finally spoke louder than his usual murmur. His voice steady but heavy with age and regret. He gathered a few elders and Arif close, smoke swirling around them like restless spirits. He admitted what many had sensed, but none had dared to say. Years ago, part of the forest had been weakened by careless clearing, done quietly to hide an old mistake tied to powerful families. Dry undergrowth left unattended, waiting for one careless spark. The words fell hard, heavier than ash. Murmurs spread quickly, shock turning into anger. Some stared at Rahim as if betrayed. Others looked away, guilt flickering across their faces. Rahim bowed his head slightly, saying, "Secrets do not disappear by being buried. They wait." and tonight they had chosen to rise. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of long-kept silence. Mira listened from a distance, her heart aching. She thought of how often the village chose comfort over truth, how children were taught stories, polished smooth, never mentioning the cracks underneath. She wondered if this fire had come to punish or to cleanse. The thought scared her, yet somewhere inside, a small, hopeful voice whispered that truth, though painful, could also heal. Arif felt torn between anger and understanding. His training had taught him to look forward, to act fast, but this demanded something different: accountability, honesty. He met Rahim's eyes and saw no malice there, only a tired man who had carried too much alone. Arif nodded once, knowing that blame could wait, but responsibility could not. Around them, the village pulsed with unease. Whispered accusations floated through smoke-filled air. Some people clutched each other protectively. Others stood apart, arms crossed, trust cracking quietly. The fire crackled on, uncaring of human guilt, yet feeding on the disorder it created, as if chaos itself were fuel. As exhaustion settled in, the arguments softened into uneasy silence. Flames glowed like watchful eyes. Beyond the home's secrets now lay exposed, raw and trembling, and Sundarpur stood changed without fully understanding how. The firelight flickered across familiar faces that suddenly felt unfamiliar, and beneath the smoke-filled sky, the village sensed that survival would now demand not just strength of body, but courage of truth. The fire roared louder now, not angry but determined, pushing forward with a sound like many hands clapping at once. Arif stood at the edge of the fields, dirt streaked across his face, eyes fixed on the path ahead. He lifted his hand, and the villagers quieted. The moment felt heavy, like the pause before a deep breath. Then he spoke, steady and clear. We cut the fire's path here, together, before it reaches the homes. Men and women moved forward with sickles and spades, cutting through dry grass and low shrubs. Hands blistered quickly, arms ached. Sparks flew close enough to sting skin. Fear fluttered in every chest, yet no one stepped back. Arif worked alongside them, clearing, shouting encouragement, dragging those who slowed from exhaustion back into rhythm. He knew the danger well. One wrong shift of wind could swallow them whole. As they worked, someone cried out. A man had stumbled, fire licking too close to his leg. Two villagers rushed in without thinking, pulling him free, wrapping him in a wet cloth. Pain did not stop him from whispering thanks. Tears cut clean lines through ash on his cheeks. In that small moment, bravery did not look loud or heroic. It looked like hands that refused to let go. Across the village, a scream tore through the noise. A house near the school had caught, flames crawling greedily up its wooden walls. Mira ran toward it before anyone could stop her. Children were inside, trapped by smoke and fear. She covered her mouth, shouting their names, heat biting at her arms as she pushed the door open. Inside, the world was blurred and choking. She found small hands reaching blindly, and she gathered them close. One by one, she guided them out, whispering steady words. Keep your eyes on me, breathe slowly. We are almost there. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. When the last child stumbled free, the roof groaned ominously. Villagers pulled Mira back just as flames collapsed inward. Cheers broke out mixed with sobs, and Mira sank to the ground, shaking, holding the children as if they might disappear. Around them, ordinary people did extraordinary things. An elderly woman kept carrying water despite trembling knees. A young boy ran messages through smoke-filled lanes. A man who had once argued loudly now shielded a stranger with his own body. Not all moments were victories. Some faltered, some froze, some cried openly when fear overwhelmed them, yet no one was shamed. Hands reached out again and again. Arif felt the weight of every decision pressing on him. He wondered if he had asked too much, led them too close. Then he saw the fire slow where the ground lay bare. Hesitating, confused, hope surged through him like cool water. He shouted again, louder now, we are doing it, keep going. And the villagers answered with renewed strength. Smoke hung thick and glowing. Embers drifted like restless fireflies. The night pulsed with heat and effort. Pain and determination tangled together. Mira watched from the side, clutching a child's hand. Tears slipping quietly as she saw neighbors stand shoulder to shoulder. Old grudges forgotten in shared exhaustion. She understood then that unity was not a grand idea. It was this, choosing each other again and again. As the firebreak widened and flames wavered uncertainly, the village breathed together for the first time in hours. Bodies sore, spirits bruised, but unbroken. The fire had not been beaten yet, but it had been challenged. And under the smoke-veiled sky, Sundarpur learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand close despite it, waiting for what the night would demand next. The fire had slowed, but it had not softened. It hissed and shifted restlessly, embers glowing like watchful eyes in the dark. As villagers paused to catch their breath, a different heat crept in, the kind that rises from words unsaid too long. Someone muttered a name, another voice answered sharply, and suddenly the night felt tighter than before, as if the smoke itself leaned in to listen. It began with a trembling confession. A young man stepped forward, ash smeared across his face, his eyes darting nervously. He spoke of seeing someone near the forest earlier that day, moving hurriedly, hiding a lantern. His voice shook as he explained how silence had been chosen over truth, because speaking would have meant power lost and land questioned. The crowd stirred uneasily, fear mixing with disbelief. Whispers spread like sparks on dry ground, fingers pointed, voices rose. Someone shouted that greed had done what fire alone could not. Another cried that lies had fed the flames. The accused stood rigid, denying at first, anger flashing across his face, then fear cracked through it. The truth spilled unevenly. He had tried to clear land secretly, had hidden the spark, had hoped the forest would swallow his mistake quietly. Mira felt her chest tighten painfully. She thought of the children she had pulled from the burning house, of books rescued with trembling hands, all of it nearly lost because someone valued gain over care. She wanted to shout, yet words failed her. Sorrow sat heavier than anger. She wondered how betrayal always managed to wound deepest when trust felt safest. Arif stepped forward, his face dark with ash and strain. He listened to the accusations, the pleas, the rising demand for punishment. His fists clenched at his sides. Training told him chaos thrived on division, yet justice pulled at his heart fiercely. He spoke slowly, reminding them that the fire still breathed nearby, that flames did not pause for arguments. His voice cracked just once, revealing how deeply This cut him too. Old Rahim closed his eyes briefly, as if offering a silent apology to the village. He spoke again, softer now, telling them that fire fed on broken bonds as much as dry wood, that punishment would come, but survival must come first. His words carried the tired wisdom of years spent watching pride undo good people. Some nodded, others looked away, unwilling to let go of their fury. The night grew restless, wind shifting unpredictably, sparks lifting and drifting dangerously close to rooftops. A distant crack echoed as another tree fell, reminding everyone that time was thinning. Villagers stood divided, some demanding the guilty be tied and answered for, others begging to focus on saving what remained. Trust fractured visibly, like clay pots dropped too often. Mira moved quietly among the children, holding hands, smoothing hair, grounding herself in their small, steady breaths. She thought of how easily anger burned, how slowly forgiveness grew. She whispered to one frightened child that the village was stronger than its mistakes, hoping she believed it as much as she wanted the child to. Arif felt the weight of leadership heavier than ever. He knew choosing unity over punishment might haunt him later, yet choosing anger now could doom them all. He raised his voice again, calling people back to their places. Some followed reluctantly, others hesitated, eyes still sharp with blame. But slowly, feet moved, buckets were lifted, spades gripped once more behind them. The guilty man sank to his knees, sobbing into ash-filled earth, the fire reflecting in his tears. No one touched him, judgment suspended like smoke, waiting for daylight. The village did not forgive him, not yet, but neither did they abandon each other. As the fire crackled on and the moon struggled behind drifting smoke, Sundarpur stood wounded and wary, bound together by necessity rather than trust, knowing that dawn would demand answers. But night still demanded courage, and in the uneasy glow of embers, the village pressed forward, carrying both its anger and its hope into the uncertain hours ahead. The wind shifted with a low sigh, carrying the smell of damp earth for just a heartbeat, and everyone paused, faces lifting toward the dark sky. A distant rumble rolled softly, like a promise whispered too soon. Hope flickered briefly, but the fire answered back with a sharp crack, reminding them it was not finished yet. Not by a long breath, Arif stepped forward again, voice hoarse but sure, and Rahim stood beside him like an old tree that had weathered many storms. Together, they spoke without haste, dividing tasks with care. Some to strengthen the firebreak, some to guard rooftops, others to guide water where heat glowed fiercest. Their words did not command, they invited, and tired heads nodded, hands moved, trust rebuilt, stitch by stitch. The villagers began to work as one body, young and old, moving side by side. Those who had argued earlier, now passing buckets without meeting each other's eyes. Grudges folded away like worn shawls for another day. The rhythm returned, water splashing, tools striking, earth. Voices calling warnings and encouragement. Unity felt fragile, yet real, like a bridge made of shared will. Mira felt a quiet swell in her chest as she watched it happen. She remembered lessons taught about cooperation, now unfolding not on blackboards, but in smoke and sweat. She wiped ash from a child's cheek and whispered that everyone was being very brave, even those who were afraid, especially those. The child nodded solemnly, holding tight to her hand. Above them, clouds gathered slowly, thick and dark. The Air grew cooler against burning skin. Villagers murmured hopeful glances upward. Rahim felt the change deep in his bones. Rain had a smell, a weight, a patience. Yet he warned gently that hope must not soften effort. Fire could outlast promises if people grew careless. The flames surged again along the forest edge, fighting stubbornly. But now they met resistance everywhere. Bare earth broke their path. Wet walls refused their hunger. Villagers moved quicker, smarter. Learning as they went, Aerith felt pride and fear braid together inside him. He knew they were turning the tide, but tides could still pull hard. Someone slipped and was lifted at once. Another faltered and was steadied. Laughter even rose briefly when a bucket drenched the wrong person. A soft, human sound amid chaos. It reminded them they were still alive, still together. Rahim smiled faintly at that, knowing joy was also a kind of strength. As the first heavy drops finally fell, hissing when they struck hot ground, a collective breath escaped the village. Rain was not victory yet, but it was companionship. The fire shrank back reluctantly. Smoke thickened, then thinned. Embers dimmed like tired eyes. Work continued with renewed determination. No one stopped too soon. Mira looked toward the forest, where shadows softened under rain. Arif stood soaked and steady beside Rahim, and Sundarpur held itself together under falling water and fading flames, knowing that dawn was coming slowly, quietly, and with it answers, healing, and the last fierce test waiting in the heart of the fire. The forest groaned like an old door pushed too far, branches snapping overhead as heat pressed close from every side. Smoke rolled thick and low, curling around ankles and throats, and somewhere within that glowing maze came the frightened cry of trapped animals, thin and desperate, tugging at hearts before minds could speak. Arif did not hesitate long. He tightened the cloth around his mouth and glanced at Mira, asking softly if she could stay back, but she shook her head with quiet resolve, her eyes steady despite the fear flickering within them. Children had been saved tonight. Lives mattered no matter their shape, and she stepped forward beside him, courage stitched carefully over terror. They moved slowly into the forest, guided by sound and instinct. Fire crackled all around, not raging now but simmering dangerously. Trees glowed from within like dying lanterns. Embers floated through the air and settled briefly on skin before being brushed away. Each breath tasted sharp and bitter, yet they pressed on, counting steps, calling softly to calm the animals. Mira felt her heart beat wildly, each thud echoing in her ears. She thought of classrooms filled with laughter, of quiet mornings arranging books. All those gentle routines felt far away, yet this moment felt strangely clear. Purpose burned brighter than fear. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, to stay close to Arifest's steady presence. A sudden crash split the air. A burning branch fell behind them, cutting off their path back. Mira gasped, panic rising fast. Arif grabbed her hand firmly, grounding her with a simple squeeze, his voice calm as he said, "Forward is safer now. Trust me." And she did, because trust often grows fastest when there is no time to doubt. They found the livestock huddled near a shallow ravine, eyes wide, bodies trembling. Arif worked quickly, cutting ropes, guiding them toward clearer ground. Mira spoke gently, coaxing them step by step, her voice low and soothing like a lullaby. One animal bolted suddenly, flames flaring nearby. and Arif lunged without thought, pulling it back just in time, heat licking dangerously close to his sleeve. Fear surged through Mira like cold water. She imagined losing him to the flames. The thought struck sharper than smoke. She called his name, her voice breaking, and he answered immediately. Still here, just singed pride, making her laugh softly despite everything. A fragile sound that felt like a small victory. They pushed deeper still, drawn by a stubborn glow that refused to die. Hidden pockets of fire smoldered beneath fallen leaves and debris, feeding the larger blaze quietly. Arif pointed it out, understanding dawning. This was the heart still beating. The reason the fire would not surrender. Together they cleared wet soil over it, stamping carefully, coughing, hands burning with effort. Mira's strength surprised her, each movement fueled by something deeper than muscle. She felt connected, not just to Arif, but to the entire village beyond the smoke. Every child, every elder, every story waiting to continue. That thought carried her through dizziness and fear, anchoring her when the forest felt like it might swallow them whole. As they turned back, the forest seemed to sigh. Flames retreating reluctantly, rain tapping more steadily now, smoke thinning just enough to reveal a narrow path home. Arif guided Mira carefully, shielding her when branches fell. She held onto his arm, no longer embarrassed by the closeness. Bonds formed in fire do not need explanation. When they emerged, soaked and exhausted, cheers broke out softly, relief washing over tired faces. Mira and Arif exchanged a look filled with shared understanding. Something unspoken and strong had grown between them, forged not in words, but in survival. Behind them, the forest glowed faintly, quieter now. Rain whispering promises through the leaves, and as Sundarpur waited on the edge of dawn, the fire's heart finally cooled, leaving space for healing answers, and the long, gentle work of rebuilding that would begin with morning light. Morning arrived quietly, not with birdsong, but with the slow scrape of feet on ash-covered ground. Smoke hung low like a tired blanket, and the village breathed in carefully, as if afraid to wake the pain too suddenly. Embers no longer glowed fiercely, only small warm reminders underfoot, and the fire at last had loosened its grip, leaving behind a silence that felt both merciful and heavy. People stepped out to look at what remained. Fields once green now lay dark and brittle. Fences leaned where flames had kissed them too long. Roofs showed blackened scars. Some homes stood wounded, yet standing. Others had bowed completely. Women pressed hands to their mouths. Men stared without speaking, and then someone began sweeping ash from a doorway, slow and steady, showing that life was still moving. The village gathered near the well, counting faces first, before counting losses. Relief passed through the crowd like a gentle wave when everyone was found, bruised, burned, exhausted, but alive. Quiet thanks were offered, hands clasped, foreheads touched, tears slipped freely now that there was space for them. Grief felt safer when shared. Mira walked through the lanes with careful steps, her eyes catching on small details. A charred slate, a rescued book laid out to dry, a child sleeping against a mother's shoulder. She felt pride swell and ache together. Teaching had never felt like this before. Lessons written not in chalk, but in courage. She promised herself she would remember every face. Arif stood near the firebreak, shoulders slumped with fatigue, staring at the land they had saved inch by inch. He replayed choices in his mind, the risks taken, the moments that could have gone wrong. Guilt brushed against him for what was lost. Yet gratitude followed close behind for what remained. Villagers approached quietly, nodding, clapping his back, not calling him a hero, just one of them. Old Rahim sat beneath a tree that had survived with half its bark burned away. He traced the scars with his fingers, thinking of secrets finally spoken. Some bonds had softened, old enemies sharing food now. Others stood farther apart than ever, eyes cold with blame that would not easily thaw. Rahim knew truth healed unevenly. Like fire, it revealed more than it destroyed. The guilty man remained apart, helping where he could, speaking little. His punishment had not been named yet, but it lived in every avoided glance, every quiet sigh. Some villagers softened seeing his work, others hardened further. Mira watched this with a heavy heart, understanding that forgiveness was a longer road than survival. As the day wore on, cooking fires were lit again, carefully, meals shared from what little remained. Laughter rose shyly at first, then stronger. Stories of close calls retold with shaking hands and grateful smiles. Children played at sweeping ash like it was sand, life insisting gently on returning when evening came. The sky cleared fully for the first time, stars blinking awake above scorched land. The village sat together in tired closeness, losses acknowledged, survival honored, and relationships reshaped forever. Some mended, some broken beyond repair. And as the cool night settled over Sundarpur, it carried a quiet understanding that rebuilding would be slow, but hope, like embers kept warm, was still alive, waiting for the morning. Sunlight spilled across Sundarpur gently, brushing over rooftops patched with fresh straw, fields that had begun to show green again, and the quiet stir of villagers returning to their routines. A breeze carried the smell of wet earth and drying wood, and everywhere there was movement, soft and determined. The village breathing life back into itself, slowly but surely. Mira walked along the main lane, pausing to greet children who raced past with tiny saplings in their hands. Laughter spilling like water over stones. She knelt occasionally to help, tie a plant or sweep ash from a doorstep, teaching them as she always had. Only now her lessons were about courage, care, and the strength of standing together. And she felt quietly proud of the small, steady changes that grew with each day. RF was repairing a broken fence with two young men who had once argued bitterly in the fire's chaos. Sweat running down his forehead, hands blackened from labor. Yet his eyes sparkled with the joy of watching old rivalries soften into cooperation. He looked toward Mira from time to time, catching her smile, and felt a steady warmth in the chest, the kind that comes when people choose hope over fear. The villagers moved like a river of determination, some rebuilding homes, others clearing burnt fields, a few tending the animals that had survived, all speaking softly, occasionally exchanging a laugh or helping hand. The memory of fire still present, like a shadow that stretched long but no longer threatened to swallow them. Every action a quiet defiance of the destruction that had come before. Mira paused to look at a rebuilt school, windows polished, books carefully returned to shelves, children already peeking inside with curiosity and delight. She ran her fingers along the spine of a rescued storybook, feeling the faint soot that remained, and whispered to herself that this was what courage looked like. Not only surviving the flames, but choosing to start again. Arif stood near the riverbank, watching villagers work together to reroute irrigation channels, his thoughts drifting to the night they had entered the heart of the fire. He remembered every crack of falling wood, every ember that had brushed skin, and realized that those memories had changed him, made him softer and fiercer at once. Grateful for those who had trusted him with their lives. Old Rahim walked slowly among the younger villagers, nodding quietly, watching hands and hearts unite, a smile tucked beneath his lined face, thinking that the village had finally learned that secrets and grudges could not survive alongside shared effort, and that sometimes the hardest lessons were taught by fire itself. Evenings were quieter now, rain pattering gently on new rooftops, the scent of cooking fires mingling with the wet earth, the sky soft with streaks of gold fading into lavender, and Sundarpur rested with a gentle satisfaction. The scars of yesterday, visible yet softened by the steady pulse of life returning. Mira and Orif often lingered by the schoolyard, watching children play and work together, sharing quiet words, small smiles. The bond between them deepened by everything they had endured, and in the hush of the cooling air, they felt hope settle like a warm blanket over the village, promising that tomorrow, like today, they would face it together. And as the stars blinked awake above the recovering village, the fields glowing faintly under moonlight, Sundarpur held itself gently between past and future, carrying memories of fire, lessons of courage, and the quiet promise of new beginnings, waiting patiently for the next story to unfold.